Good morning and welcome to our series on digital accessibility compliance. I am Sherry Prupis. I'm Director of Teaching and Learning with Technology, as well as the Director of the Digital Accessibility Compliance Initiative. Today, we want to talk to you about images, and for our examples, we want to be more specific about arts and humanities. With us, we have both Serbi and Nitesh. Nitesh is our magician behind the scene handling our slide deck, and Serbi is our expert who's going to be speaking to us today. Reminder that we are recording this session and we will share out the recording, that there is a spot for you to do questions and answers. If you don't see the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, click the more and then you'll see Q&A. And for those of you who prefer to read as well as listen, when you go to the more button, you will see a small CC and it will say show captions, and you can show captions at the bottom. Serbi, I'm turning this over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our next session of the Digital Accessibility Compliance series. Today, we are going to focus on image accessibility. So I know accessibility can sometimes feel a bit technical, but images are actually at the heart of your teaching, especially when we talk about arts and humanities. So they are not just decoration, they actually carry meaning, emotion, and argument. So here's the question of the day. What happens if a student cannot see the image? If the image holds information and the discussion depends on image completely, would the student be able to get the information, or he or she would be immediately left out of the entire conversation? In this session, we are going to look at how to turn visual into clear words so that every student can fully participate. For people who have already attended sessions earlier on image accessibility might be familiar with the concept and also might find it repetitive, as the principle remains the same for accessibility. So let's move ahead. Next slide, please. So some of you might know me from earlier sessions, but if you are new here, let me give a quick introduction of myself. I'm Surbhi Lohia, and I have been working in digital accessibility and inclusive design for over 11 years now. I began my career training students with visual impairment to use computers independently. I'm also 100% blind, as I started losing my vision at the age of 18. And I actually understand what it means to see and what it feels like when the content is not designed for everyone. So today I'm here to bridge the gap between visual images and the meaning that they carry for someone who cannot see them. So let's see what's stored in for today. Next slide, please. Let us take a quick look at what we are going to cover today. First, we will talk about why image descriptions really matter, not just from a legal perspective, but from a teaching and learning perspective. Then we will look at different types of images and how the approach changes from decorative images to complex ones. We'll also look at some core principles to help you write descriptions that are clear and effective without feeling overwhelmed. Then we'll look at how we can leverage AI here and make the entire process more efficient. We'll also be looking at the real-time examples, something similar to what you use in lectures and course materials, so that you can see how it works in context. And finally, we'll talk about some helpful resources, a quick checklist, and wrap up with your Q&A at the end. So without wasting much time, let's get started. Next slide, please. Let us pause for a moment and really talk about why this matters so much. Think about how often we rely on visuals in everyday life. For example, if someone shares a flyer for an event and all the details are inside the image, has no description at all. Now, for someone who cannot see, they miss the entire context and will have no access to that information. The date, time, location, all of that is lost. The same thing happens when they shop online, and an item is labeled as image one instead of describing the color or material. They cannot make an informed decision themselves. Now, let's bring that into your classrooms. In many of your courses, images are not just decorative, they are evidence, arguments, and sometimes they are the primary source, like a historical photograph, it could be a handwritten manuscript, a painting, etc. These visuals often carry the core insight. So, if there is no alternative text, a student using screen reader cannot access the information at all. The discussion moves forward, but they are actually left out of that experience. And that becomes a learning gap, not just a technical issue. Alternative text makes sure that the meaning does not stay locked inside the image. So, if a map shows movement from rural areas to cities over time, that trend needs to be described in words. Similarly, if a sculpture demonstrates power through posture and scale, that idea needs to be expressed in text. Another point is these materials also live in many places, like you upload them to learning platforms, share documents, and students also open them on different devices and platforms. Now, so when images include meaningful description, the learning travels with them, even if they are not visible. So here is the simple idea. If an image is there to teach something, then that meaning must also exist in text, not as an extra step, but as an essential part of accessible teaching. Next slide, please. Now, this is where things start to get practical because not all images are the same. And honestly, our approach cannot be the same either. So I would like to think of it like a museum gallery where some things are just there for the background, the overall feel, and others are the main exhibit that really demands attention. So first, let us talk about decorative images. These are the ones used mostly for visual interest or the overall aesthetics. Now, it could be a subtle background pattern or a small design element that does not really add any meaning. In such cases, you actually do not need to write any alternative text. You just mark them as decorative, and the screen reader or assistive technology would skip it or announce it as decorative. By this, the student is not forced to hear a description of something that is not supporting learning. Now, what is the moral of the story? We do not describe everything, but only what really matters for understanding. Then we have informative images. So these are probably the ones you use all the time in your teaching or your classes. It could be a photograph of a historical figure, an image of a sculpture, or an icon that represents an idea or even a concept. So these images, they carry these images carry meaning, but usually in a focused way. So here you just need to describe the key ideas and not every tiny detail, just enough so that the student understands why the image is there and how it connects to your learning. For a generic example, like we have these no entry signboards or pedestrian crossing signboards, where we do not describe the shape of or color of the icon, but only the real information. Then we have the complex images, and this is where many of us spend most of the time because images that carry a lot of information, something like an annotated painting with layers of symbolism or a detailed historical timeline filled with dates and events, etc. Now, for these complex images, you cannot capture all that in just one short sentence or in an alternative text. So the strategy here is very simple. You write a short alternative text that identifies the image and its purpose, and then provide a longer, more detailed description nearby. So that could be anywhere, like in a different slide, it could be in an appendix, or it could also be as a link which is leading to a different document. The only important thing to note here is that you need to mention the location of the detailed description in the alternative text for sure. This way, every student gets access to the same depth of analysis that is visually depicted. And I would really like to emphasize here the goal is to convey the meaning and not to describe every single visual detail. So you're not trying to recreate the image pixel by pixel. You're actually helping the student access the information that the image is meant to teach. And when you start thinking about it in this direction, it suddenly becomes much more manageable and actually very aligned with how you already teach. Next slide, please. Before you even start typing the description, now it really helps to slow down and ask a few simple questions to yourself. Now, think of it like preparing for a seminar discussion where you always start with a why before you get into the how. So, the first question to ask is, what information does this image actually convey? Not every little detail, but the core message. And if you were to take that image away from your slide or handout, would your student miss something important for the lesson? If the answer is yes, then you know this image needs a thoughtful description. Next, think about the learning goal of the image. For example, if you're showing a photo of a Gothic cathedral to a class of first year students, you might just want to notice the overall scale and the point of arches. But if you are teaching an advanced architecture seminar, the goal might be to focus on the specific engineering of the flying buttresses. So your description should always match the goal and who your students are and what you want them to learn from that image. So this also leads to our next point, to definitely consider who your audience is, as it can completely change the level of detail and the way you describe images. Finally, think about the type of image it is. So whether it is decorative, informative, or complex. We talked about these categories earlier, and knowing this right away guides your strategy and makes your writing much more natural. So, good alternative text does not start with writing, it actually starts with thinking in the right direction. So, when you ask the right questions first, your description becomes much clearer, much more intentional, and really serves your teaching goal. Next slide, please. Now that we have asked the right questions, the next step is to actually write the description. And this is where having a simple framework really helps. Now, I would like to use an acronym called ACORN here. Just like a small acorn contains um, everything which is required to grow a large tree. So a short piece of text can actually carry the full meaning of the complex visual if it is written well. So this acronym is not global, it is just a created acronym for easy and better understanding. So first, let's look at accuracy. Focus on the key information that matters to your lesson, not the decorative frame or background colors, unless they are part of the story. Now, if you are showing a painting to a to explore social class. For example, describe what reveals class, like clothing, posture, or settings. You do not need to mention every shade of color unless it is, again, central to your teaching goal. Second, be concise. So, in most of the cases, one or two lines are enough for alternative text. But if you find yourself writing a paragraph, that is usually a sign that this information belongs in the main longer detail, not in the alternative text. Third, be objective. So the goal here is to describe what is there, not how you feel about it. So avoid words like a beautiful painting, or instead just describe the clouds, the mountains, the figures, and let the student decide how it makes them feel based on what they can actually access. Finally, make sure the description is relevant and necessary to the context. So ask yourself, what does the student need to learn from this image to meet the learning objective? If a detail does not support that, like the color of a photo frame, it can actually be completely left out. So, using the acorn approach helps keep description focused and meaningful, which might look very small, but carries the core message of the visuals. Next slide, please. Now, this slide is one of my favorites because honestly, most of us have fallen into at least one of these traps when we first start writing image description. So it is a bit like learning to write a good thesis statement where you want to find that sweet spot between too much and too little. So first, we have these descriptions which are very vague. For example, saying something like a painting from the Renaissance. Now, technically, that is not wrong, but does it really help a student who's using a screen reader understand any meaning out of that? Not really, right? So they know the time period, but they do not know what is happening in the image, who is in the scene, or why are you even showing this image? Then there we have the opposite problem, that is being too detailed. So sometimes we get excited and try to describe every color, every tiny brush stroke, every object in the background. But if those details are not connected to the learning goal, they can actually overwhelm the students. So more detail does not mean always more clarity. Another trap is missing the main point, like saying a beautiful artwork showing people. Now, this might sound simple and nice, but it does not communicate the purpose. For example, who are the people? What are they doing? And why does it even matter for this lesson, etc.? And then we have these jargon heavy descriptions. So, language in arts and humanities definitely loves terminology, but if alternative text is packed with technical terms without context, then it can confuse more than helping a student. So, always remember alternative text is the place to provide access and not to confuse someone. So, what could be a better version of the picture that you see on the slide? Something like Renaissance era painting depicting a formal court scene, emphasizing social hierarchy through clothing and positioning. No, now what that does is it gives time period, it gives setting, and most importantly, it highlights the learning focus in this case, that is social hierarchy. So the fix is simple: be specific, uh, but purposeful, clear but not overloaded, and always bring it back to the meaning that you want someone to take away. And that is what makes the description effective and correct. Next slide, please. Let's talk about what I would like to call the secret weapon in your accessibility toolkit. So, artificial intelligence tools like Copilot, Gemini, ChatGPT, and others can actually be incredibly helpful partners when it comes to drafting image description, especially for complex images in arts and humanities. Uh, For visuals, which can be very time consuming, especially, it can really be helpful. Now, before jumping into how we use that, there are two ground rules that I would like to mention here. First, always follow your college or institutional policy around the use of AI. And second, which is completely non negotiable, never upload any sensitive data or student data or even assessment data or private or identifiable content in these tools. Now, talking about its use, this is where the AI really shines and also where it often goes wrong. Now, the power is in the prompt. Now, if you give a vague prompt, you will definitely get a vague or a generic description. But if you give the right prompt, once that very specific and grounded in context, you will get much better results. So, being clear about the target audience and learning goal makes a huge difference. For example, instead of saying describe this image, you might say describe this image for first year undergraduate students in an art history course, focusing on social class representation. Now, the AI knows what level of detail to use and what actually matters. This also becomes useful for exams and assessments. So, if an image is part of a test that you want the student to understand, the visuals without giving away the answer, you just need to give the right prompt. This way, the description supports access without compromising the assessment. So again, specific content context-based prompts lead to better and more usable alternative text, much more than the generic ones. Another important thing is to remember is once the AI generates the draft, your role is not done yet. So, expert and manual review is essential here. So, when an AI acts as the assistants and you act as the final editor, accessibility becomes faster, more accurate, and much easier to scale without losing quality or ethics. Next slide, please. So, this slide really shows the power of contextual prompting. And honestly, this is where many of us see a big difference. Now, let us start with a simple prompt that is generate alternative text for this image. That's it. Very short, very general. What do you usually get back now? Something like a painting of people standing in a boat on a river. Now, technically, that is not wrong, but is it helpful in a history classroom? I don't think so, right? It describes what you see at a surface level, but it does not connect the meaning, composition, or your learning goals. So it actually misses the drama, the struggle, and the historical weight of the moment. Now, let us look at the second prompt on the slide, which is much more specific. Now, that level of guidance changes everything. The generic alternative text now becomes something like historical painting of soldiers crossing an icy river in a small boat with a central standing figure at and a raised flag amid harsh winter conditions and collective struggle. So, if you notice the difference here, the second version highlights composition, points to positioning, reflects struggle and determination, and also respects the instruction not to reveal the identities and stays concise. Now, it gives students the visual evidence that they need to connect to your lecture on determination or leadership. And of course, this example is for learning material, not assessment. Now, if you're using images in exams or quizzes, you have to be extra careful not to accidentally reveal answers. So, the big takeaway is very simple. Better context leads to better content. When you define your audience, your intent, and even technical details like length and tone, or lecture or assessment, the output improves dramatically. So, artificial intelligence responds to clarity, and as faculty, you're already experts in defining learning goals. So, you just need to add the same clarity in your prompts, and you will see a real difference in the quality of the alternative text as well as the long description. Next slide, please. Now we are going to move into examples from real visuals, and I want to set up the stage before we dive in. So, the alternative text and longer descriptions that you're going to see were generated using artificial intelligence and were also reviewed manually by humans. Definitely, they are refined to align with teaching goals, but they might still have small inaccuracies in terms of your subject, as I'm not the subject matter expert in arts and humanities. So, the goal here is not to look for perfect content for the subject, but to focus on accessibility. So, if you notice something that does not fully match the subject, please keep your attention on how the description makes the visual accessible and the overall concept of making images accessible. Next slide, please. Let us look at our first real example. Now, imagine you are teaching a course on modern art and you show this famous painting by Picasso called Girl Before a Mirror. To figure out how to describe it, we start with those questions that we talked about it earlier. First, what is the learning goal? Well, you probably want your students to analyze things like symbolism and how Cubism uses multiple perspectives. Now, if a student cannot see the fragmented forms or the intense colors, or contrast between the woman and her reflection, they are definitely missing the heart of the lesson. Because this is such a complex piece of art, we have to decide if the short sentence is enough. In this case, definitely it is only a starting point. So for the short alternative text, you could say it is a cubist painting of a woman looking into a mirror, showing a contrasting reflection with bold colors and geometrical shapes. Now, this gives the student who's using a screen reader a big picture immediately. But for a deep dive into the symbolism of the reflection or the geometric patterns, you would definitely want a longer description that we are going to see in the next slide. Next slide, please. Now, since we decided that the Picasso painting is a complex image, we definitely need the longer description to really give the student the full picture. Now, think about how you would describe this to someone over the phone. If they have never seen a cubist work before, you would want to break it down logically. We start with the figure on the left, describing how her face is split into two distinct tabs with those lavender and yellow tones. And then we move to the reflection, which is such a key part of the meaning. Now we point out that it is darkened and it uses those purple and oranges, which suggests a shift in perspective. And finally, we talk about the overall composition, like the diamond patterns in the background and those bold black outlines that define the style. By providing this level of detail in a longer description nearby in your materials, you're actually giving a student who cannot see the image the exact same evidence that they need to join the class discussion on symbolism or modern art. So it takes a little more effort, but it ensures that no one is left out of the deep analysis. Next slide, please. Now let's look at a completely different kind of image, that is a layered historical timeline. As faculty, you know how important it is for students to see the big picture of how different movements overlap in a history or literature course. Your learning goal might be to show how a political revolution happened at the exact same time a specific literary movement was flourishing. So that sense of things happening all at once can be very hard to grasp. So if you just read a list of dates and if a student can't see how these bars aligned vertically on the slide, they're actually missing the core relationship that you are trying to teach because this image has so many layers and dates. So definitely a one sentence alternative text would not um, explain everything that you want to um, explain in the layered historical timeline, like political, cultural, or literally development that are aligned across. Now, this lets the student know exactly what kind of data is coming up. But to truly understand the overlapping, we definitely need to provide a more detailed breakdown. So let's check in our next slide with regards to the longer description. Next slide, please. Now, because this timeline is so dense with information, a simple caption would not do it justice. So think of it, this longer description, like a verbal map of infographic material. So we start by giving the student the overall structure, explaining that the chart moves from left to right across 6 centuries and is divided into 3 horizontal bands. Now, this helps the student who's using a screen reader build a mental grid before we even get into the details. Then we break it down by um, categories like politics, cultural, and literature instead of just listing dates. So we are actually describing the visual cues that you have included in the image, like icons of cathedrals for politics or printing press for literature. We also make sure to mention those colored arrows connecting the icons. And that is very crucial because those arrows represent the actual intellectual connection that you want them to see or understand. Finally, we touch on the visual style like the parchment background and the antique aesthetics so that the student understand the mood of the material as well as the data. So, by providing this level of detail, it ensures that the great moment of seeing those historical labs is available to everyone in the room. Next slide, please. Our next example takes us onto the stage. Now, if you are teaching theater or dance, you would know that the stage diagram is essentially a piece of sheet music for movement. The instructional purpose here is to help student visualize blocking where performers stand, how they move, and their spatial relationship to one another. Now, if a student cannot see the proximity of one performer to another or the paths that they take across the floor, they actually lose the entire choreography of the scene. So, for a diagram like this, you definitely would like to start with a clear, short alternative text, something like stage diagram showing 8 performers. Positioned across stage with spacing and dashed lines indicating movement and relationship. Now, this gives student the immediate who and where of the visuals. However, because of the specific parts and groupings are so vital to understand, the scene's tension or flow, the longer description is definitely required. Um, so let's see in the next slide what the longer description would be. Next slide, please. So when we look at a diagram like this, the longer description needs to act as a set of stage direction for the mind's eye. We start by setting up the scene, that is an overhead view of a stage framed by curtains that helps the student to understand the orientation of the room immediately. Then we describe the performers almost like a narrative. We point out the two figures in the center who are facing each other because that suggests the primary interaction or a moment of dialogue. By mentioning the other figures placed towards the front and back, we are explaining the depth of the stage and how you're using focus in separation to tell a story. Finally, we highlight those dashed lines, which are not just marks on the page. They represent actual energy and movement parts of the actors. So by describing this way, you're actually helping the student understand that the blocking is not random. It is a deliberate choice to communicate meaning. And this level of detail allows the student who is blind or low vision to analyze the scene's dynamic just as effectively as any other student who is looking at it in your class. Next slide, please. For our final example, we are looking at a map, the tool that we use constantly in humanities to show how ideas, goods, people move across the globe. Now, the instructional purpose here is not just to show where a country is located. It is actually help student visualize the spatial patterns and regional connection. So now if you are teaching um, a unit on the Silk Road or 19th century trade, the story is in the lines connecting the dots. Now, if a student cannot see the specific land and sea routes, they actually lose the sense of proximity and direction that defines the historical narrative. Because maps are inherently dense, we start with a clear anchor in alternative text. So, something like an illustrative world map showing regions connecting by land and sea routes to demonstrate movement and spatial connections. Now, this tells a student that the focus of this image is connectivity, not just geography. To explain how this region interact, you'll definitely need to provide the narrative of the map in a longer description. Next slide, please. Now let's walk through the longer description for this map and check how it emphasizes relationship rather than individual countries or continent. Now the map is illustrative and shows continents without countries, borders, or labels. That tells a student immediately that the focus is not political or geography, but it is rather connection and movement across regions. Circular points appear in different areas connected by solid and dashed lines that represents land and sea routes. Now, small icons of ship caravans indicate different modes of movement, helping students understand how trade, migration, or cultural exchange occurs. This description is all about the flow of interaction as it highlights direction, proximity, and connection rather than exact location. So by the end, a student who cannot see the map can actually picture the regions, the routes, and the movement happening across them. So they gain the same conceptual understanding of connectivity as someone viewing the visuals and in real. This is what effective accessible description does. It actually transforms a static image into a clear story that supports the learning goal without getting lost in unnecessary details. Next slide, please. This slide is especially important because assessment require a slightly different mindset. Now, when we design accessible images for exams or quizzes, the goal is clear. The image should support understanding, not require student to interpret um, interpret it just to answer the question. Now, in other words, we are actually measuring learning, not their eyesight or their senses. For example, Imagine including a historical painting and asking students to analyze themes of power or resistance. That now that's fine, but if that is the only way to answer correctly, um, by noticing a tiny detail that is not described, a student who cannot see the image has already this a disadvantage. That is not accessing, not or I would say not assessing knowledge. It's actually assessing observation. So to avoid this, it helps to focus on the purpose of the question and the relationship in the visuals rather than every visible detail. The alternative text should be neutral, like giving just enough orientation, like historical painting showing a military scene or stage diagram with performers positioned across set without explaining the analysis or without revealing the answer. If a full description would give away the correct response, that's a signal to redesign the question, perhaps. So, using the text based case study or another analytical approach. So the key takeaway here is that accessible assessment measures understanding of the student, not observation. And keeping this principle in mind would definitely ensure a fair and equitable experience for all of your students. Next slide, please. You might recognize this image as it is it is the same modern extract painting that we were discussing earlier. And I wanted to bring it back to highlight an important point, like how we handle an image changes completely when we move from a lecture to an assessment. Now, during instructions, our goal was to help student explore symbolism, abstraction, and multiple perspective. That is why we provided both short text and longer description so that the student could engage completely with the visual structure. Uh, in an assessment, context, however, context shifts here. So we want the image to support understanding without giving away the answers. Because meaning in this painting comes through abstraction and symbolism, a detailed long description, if not prompted right, could unintentionally give away the answer that we are trying to measure. So instead, what you can do is you can provide a neutral alternative text and brief something like modern abstract painting showing two stylized human figure with bold colors and geometric shapes. Now, this gives student orientation without interpretation. And in this way, we can assess conceptual understanding, like asking about themes of abstraction, the role of symbolism, or the artist's intent without requiring students to identify visual details that only sighted students could see. So this example shows how the same image in the same learning objective can be used differently depending whether the goal is on instruction or assessment, ensuring that we measure understanding rather than observation or what the student actually sees. Next slide, please. So for this example, let us take a look at how a neutral long description works in an assessment setting compared to the detailed one that we used earlier. So if you notice, this description stays pretty much on the surface. It mentions things like bold colors, the geometric forms, and that one figure looks like a reflection, but it doesn't go into interpretation. So we are not using words like anxiety, inner self, or dual identity. The point here is to describe what is actually visible without giving away the analytical and why. So this is really important because it sets up the assessment questions, which focuses on bigger ideas rather than visual details. So instead of asking a student to spot some hidden symbol, We might ask, why do modern artists use abstraction instead of realism? Or how does abstraction allow artists to explore identity? So the alternative text and this neutral description gives student a starting point so that they know it's a painting of two stylized, colorful geometrical figures. And from there, they can use what they have learned in your lecture and think through the question and provide their analysis. Even if a student cannot see the painting, they still have the access to the content and they can participate fully in the challenge that is there in the assessment. So, this is really what accessible assessment is all about, making sure that we are measuring understanding and not anyone's sense to see. Next slide, please. Now, let's look at how we would handle that complex historical timeline in an exam setting. So, when we were teaching this, we wanted students to see exactly how the bars for politics, culture, and literature lined up. But for an assessment, we run into a bit of challenge. The layout itself is the information. So this is how the relationship are communicated. So a student using a screen reader cannot just glance along these layers to see that the book was published at the same time a war started. Now, if we describe all those overlaps in detail, the alternative text, we are actually giving away the answer. So once again, we pivot here. We keep the learning objective the same. We still want students to understand how these historical periods overlap, but we change the way we measure it. So instead of asking a question like, according to the chart, which political event happened at the same time as this book, which is just testing the visual track, we use the image as contextual support. So we shift the focus to historical reasoning. Um, and students might see the image for a general sense of the era, but the questions ask them to analyze the impact of overlap space on what they studied in class. Now, if you notice, the alternative text here is just a high level summary, multi layered timeline showing historical developments across multiple centuries. Now, it tells them what the tool is without revealing the specific connections that they need to reason through. It keeps the rigor on history and not on their senses. So, in this way, students demonstrate understanding through analysis and reasoning, not by visually navigating a complex layout and the theme that you are seeing in uh, real. Next slide, please. Now, let's see how this timeline works in an assessment setting with uh, the longer description. So the description here is stripped down to essentials, and it tells students that the timeline is organized into layers representing different types of historical developments. So it notes that the timeline spans several centuries and suggests that events in different domains overlap. And this is the key. It does not name any specific king, um, book, or date. So, by keeping the focus completely on structure and concept rather than details, we can actually ask meaningful questions. For example, why are timelines useful for understanding historical changes over time? Or what does overlapping development across domain suggest about a historical period? So students who cannot see the chart use it as a visual prompt to think about these connections, and student using the descriptions have the exact same conceptual framework. So this removes barrier of visual tracking and replaces them with a actual historical reasoning. So the image provides context um, and the description provides orientation and The assessment measures understanding, not visual perception. So this is the core principle that we keep coming back to. Accessible assessments let every student demonstrate their knowledge no matter how they access the visual material. Next slide, please. Now let's look at our third assessment example, and this brings us back to the stage diagram from a performance study. Now, during instruction, that diagram helps students understand blocking, spatial relationship, and movement across the stage. It visually showed who stands near whom, who faces whom, and how movements create meaning. But in an assessment setting, we have to be very thoughtful. The image is used to demonstrate spatial relationship in performance, but it cannot be used for uh, graded spatial identification. So, in other words, we should not ask students to count how many performers are on the left side of the stage or identify exactly who's standing closest to front corner, because that would require vision. The challenge is that the meaning and the stage diagram often depends on performer placements and movements. So if we provide a very detailed description of movement, paths, and position, we may unintentionally reveal the answer of the assessment question. So the accessible approach is to keep the same learning objective, but change the assessment method. We use the image for orientation only, and the alternative text might say um, stage diagram showing multiple performance arranged across the stage, um, implied movement paths. Now, this gives a general idea without giving away the specific relationship. Then we assess conceptual understanding of blocking. For example, how does blocking influence audience perception of character relationship? Or what might a director separate two, two characters physically on stage during a conflict scene? So, in this way, students demonstrate understanding of theatrical principles, not their ability to visually uh, see the image. Next slide, please. Now, let us look at how that stage diagram works when we use it in assessment setting. And let us be clear about the goal here. So in teaching, the diagram helped everyone see blocking and spatial relationship. But in a test, we cannot ask a student to visually track positions or count performance, as I mentioned earlier. So the description we provide is simple and neutral. Something like the image depicts a stage viewed from above, multiple performer silhouettes arranged across the space, and the layout suggests um, intentional positional um, and movement without indicating specific character roles or actions. Now, if you notice, what we do not do here is we do not explain exactly who is near whom. We do not trace movement path. We do not describe specific spatial distances. We just give a broad idea so that the student knows the context. Now, the question shifts from the real objectives. For example, why is blocking important in theatrical performance? Or how does performer position influence where an audience looks? So these questions assess conceptual understanding, not visual tracking, as we discussed earlier. So a student does not need to count performers or identify the location. They actually need to explain the purpose and effect of blocking and arrangement. So the image gives context, the description gives access, and the assessment gives focus on theatrical principles, not principle detection. So again, this is the same pattern that we use, like I mentioned in our earlier assessment examples. Next slide, please. Now, let us look at our fourth and final assessment example, which brings us back to that abstract map diagram that we discussed earlier. Now, during teaching, that map helps students see spatial patterns, connections, and movements across regions. So they could visually trace routes, judge distances, and make sense of how places relate. But in an assessment setting, we have to approach it differently. In this context, the image is used for context only, so it cannot be used directly for graded spatial identification. So we should not ask student to follow a specific route or trace a path or identify a location on the map, because that would again require visual navigation. The challenge here is that maps rely on visual navigation and spatial tracing. So, someone using a screen reader cannot follow routes visually or judge distance or directions. And if we provide alternative text or a long description that explains every route and connection, we reveal the answer here. So, the accessible approach is to keep the same learning objective but change the assessment method. So, in practice, we do not assess. Locating route or tracing path or identifying visual position. Instead, we assess understanding of the geographic influence of movement in spatial and spatial reasoning, um, concepts and cause and effect relationship. So we might ask how geography influence trade, or migration patterns, or how spatial factors shape cultural connections over time. So the alternative text that you see does not provide any answer, and they understand what the image is about from what you had mentioned during your lecture, and it does not require any visual cues or any visual, like they do not need to see the image to assess to take the assessment. Next slide, please. Now let us see how this abstract map works in an actual assessment, like with the long description. So as I mentioned earlier, in the a lecture, they could get all the visual details. They could see patterns, rely on the routes that it provides. So here, what we do is um, we ask students to follow so if we ask a student to follow a route or find any particular location, again, it will not be accessible. So the solution is to use the image for context only. So we keep the same learning goals, understanding geography and movement, but shift how we measure them. So instead of tracing lines, we ask conceptual questions. What might, like, why might traders choose a sea route over land, or how did geography shape migration, trade, and cultural connections? So, this approach ensures that every student has the context that they need to know uh, in order to learn the image, and it gives the understanding of the context and relationship rather than interpretation of the image. Next slide, please. Now, let us wrap up with testing and some helpful resources. And I would like to leave you with some practical ways to actually check your work. So you don't have to be an expert to get started here. You can just use the built-in accessibility checkers in PowerPoint, Google Slides, or Microsoft Suite. And they are surprisingly very good at catching missing alternative text. If you're feeling brave, try to turn on a screen reader like VoiceOver on your phone or NVDA on your Windows laptop, and it would be a real eye opener to hear your own slides read back to you. Another way to test your work is to ask yourself, if the image was removed, would the student still get the point of the lesson? Now, this simple test will ensure that the visual is actually supporting the learning rather than being something um, um, just there as an image. You can also use tools that can help you scan content for missing alternative text or other accessibility issues like Wave. is one of the tools that highlights potential problems with alternative text and another accessibility features. And it also shows you where you can improve. When you're checking for alternative text, make sure every meaningful image has an alternative text which is specific and it conveys the right purpose of the image. Now, this connects back to the idea of alternative text that it should give equivalent access to information, not just repeat how something looks. It also helps to keep in mind the core guidelines like WCAG and broader policies like Section 508, ADA, and European standards. Now, for these standards are definitely the legal compliance. So if you want to go over it, you can reach out. You can go through these links provided in the uh, slide. Next slide, please. So we've definitely covered a lot today, and the only thing that I would like you to remember is that alternative text is not just about describing pictures, but it is about making sure that every student has equal access to what you're teaching, and not every image needs alternative text. So don't be afraid to mark something as decorative if it does not add any meaning to the lesson. Try to use the ACORN method to guide um, your descriptions and make them accurate, concise, um, relevant, and necessary. And for those big complex images, remember the two-step approach. Give a short alternative text to anchor the student and a longer description for a deeper dive. Now, most importantly, keep testing your work and try the built-in checkers or use screen readers and get feedback from students using it in a real time. Now, when we do this, we are not just following rules, we are actually creating a classroom where everyone can learn and participate. Next slide, please. Looking ahead, we'll be diving into how to make our video fully accessible and how to handle the unique challenges of accessibility in an Excel. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time. And I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. Or looking at the time, I think I can get back to you with the document as well. Thank you once again.
Thank you. So I have a collection of all the questions that were posted in the Q&A. I will share them with Serbi and Nitesh, and we will provide you with the responses to it. A lot of the questions revolved around assessments, how you use images in assessments. And while you addressed it as you were addressing it, they had additional answers, so you'll see that. And one of the responses, which may have been by two people that I thought was an important one, is that this seems quite overwhelming. And so my suggestion is that people go through their courses and put in the alt text. That won't take so long to do, but that's the one that's 150 characters or less. And then more slowly making generative AI their friend and understanding what questions to ask in the prompt. Begin to work on the long descriptions. But do the alt text first, because should a student not have self-disclosed, but has trouble looking at an image, they need to know what image they're having difficulty with so they can reach out to you and say, I need more information about this image. So at least have the alt text as soon as you can, and then more slowly work on the long description. All right, so I want to thank all of you for giving us your time this morning. And Serbi and Nitesh, thank you for the presentation, and we will see you all soon in our other sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye bye.